Hello everyone and welcome to the Property Podcast. It's episode 208. I'm Rob B. With me is Rob D. And this week we get back in our time machines, go back in time and tell you what we'd do if we started again.
Yes, thank you for joining us in our time machine for episode 208. We're going to be talking, as Rob said, about how we'd invest in property if we started again. We were just having a little chat about it before we started recording. I think it's going to be really interesting. We've got an interesting news story as well and a cracking resource. But before we get into all that, Rob, you've been rubbing shoulders with the rich and the famous this week, I believe.
Well, I don't know if he's that rich. He might be. Well, it depends really if you're a bookworm, if you think he's famous. But yeah, Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, a book that we've referenced on this podcast before, I believe, was in London, first time in years. And he had an event on in the morning, which was great. But then I was very lucky to have a mastermind lunch session with him and some other business owners afterwards. And it was really, really insightful. First of all, because I wasn't hosting the mastermind with you, Rob, I was actually participating in one, which was really nice, actually. It was really, really interesting to see how it works from the other side. But just the value of the knowledge of the person at the front of the room, Jim Collins, who's an incredible guy, very, very impressive. But actually, the people around the room as well, I got just as much out of it from that as well. So it's nice to have the tables turned and see it from a different point of view. A slightly different subject, obviously. It's about building businesses from good to great, but property to business. So yeah, really good day, really enjoyed it. Good lunch too.
Always important. Well, you were good before, Rob, so let's see how you are now after that.
Hopefully great.
Well, also insightful and enjoyable was getting down to the Brighton meetup last week. So first Thursday of every month, of course, is meetup day. I went down to Brighton for the first of the relaunched meetups there, and it was absolutely brilliant. Great venue, probably about 20, 25 people there with loads of different types of experience. There were people there who've been buying property in Brighton for decades pretty much and know the area absolutely inside out. But there are also people there who've been priced out of Brighton for obvious reasons and are now looking at going up north. And it was nice to see a few people who didn't know each other but wanted to do the same thing, getting to come together and talk and kind of share information about not just the local area, but getting out of the local area and going somewhere else. So it was a really good mix. I think that's going to be a great meetup. So if you are down on the south coast, put it in your diary. First Thursday of next month, get along to the Brighton meetup, or if not that one, get along to another one near you. Thepropertyhub.net/meetups is the place to go.
Right, time for our news story of the week. An Airbnb. We've talked about it a fair bit on the podcast before, and it's not often it's out the headlines, and it's back in this week. But not in the UK, but not too far away, in Dublin. And the housing minister there is not happy with Airbnb. And he's met them because of concerns that their business is driving up rents and removing housing stock from the rental market in Dublin. We've heard this before in many different cities. And the pressure on the Irish government to limit the number of days that the property can be made available to let on Airbnb. And the findings showed that there were 3,000 listings in Dublin, which were being made available for more than 90 nights a year. So it's not people just letting out rooms here and there to fill a gap. It's people using it, as we've talked about on the podcast before, as a property investment strategy. So that's no surprise, but it's interesting that the governments, local governments, are looking at Airbnb and being concerned.
Yeah, and this follows something that happened recently in London as well. I don't think we talked about on the podcast, but there was an existing law in London saying that without planning permission, you could only rent out a short-term let for up to 90 days a year. Little known, widely ignored, of course. But then Airbnb suddenly said that they were going to be enforcing it, and they actually would be monitoring the number of nights booked in London on their website. And as soon as you tick over that 90 days, your property will be taken down. So they're going to be enforcing that law. Now, that, of course, isn't something that they're going to do just because they've got, oh, we missed that. We really must make sure we're abiding by the law here. There will have been some pressure to make them do that. And so I thought it was interesting to see that pressure in London. Seems like there's some pressure going on in Dublin as well. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Because Airbnb, like Uber, it's one of these companies that's got massive scale. And by getting there quickly, it's allowed it to have a lot of power and change the way that things are done in positive ways and in negative ways. And now we're going to kind of come into this phase where we'll see where the balance of power settles with the companies on one side and politicians on the other. So don't know where it's going to settle, but it's going to be interesting over the next couple of years to see how this develops. And if you are using sort of like an Airbnb holiday letting model, definitely something to keep a close eye on, because I think one thing we can say for sure is things aren't going to stay exactly the same.
I think that's what we can say with all things in property, Rob. I agree. Definitely, the only certainty is uncertainty. But the great thing is, if you are interested in Airbnb, we have a podcast for you. We've covered the subject. Go to the propertyhub.net/podcast. And we've got a search bar there. We don't really talk about this, Rob, actually, but it's a really cool tool that you can go in and type any word that you like to learn about in property. So it might be funding deposits, or it might be Airbnb. You type it in and it'll bring up all the episodes that are related to that. So take advantage of it. I can't believe we're not actually... That should be a resource of the week, because it's a powerful tool. Obviously, a lot of podcasts now. And people go, oh, can you do a podcast on this? And we've actually already done it. So check out the search bar at thepropertyhub.net/podcast. And if you're interested in any topic, not just Airbnb, type it in and see what we've done. And then if we haven't, please do give us a nudge, because we will record it gladly.
Yes, we will. And this week's topic was prompted by a question that we had. I can't remember quite where it came from. We've had this one on our list for a while, but haven't got round to doing it. But it's a really interesting question. How would we invest in property if we started again? So there are two different ways of looking at this question, and we're going to do it both ways. So you could say, all right, well, if we went back in time, so to back when we started investing, with the benefit of hindsight, what would we have done differently? And then the other way of looking at it would be like, okay, well, we are today in 2017, knowing what we know now, but say we didn't have any of our portfolios, how would we do things? We're going to look at it from both those angles, and I think they're going to be different in some interesting ways. And knowing what we now know, we can probably look back and say that we've made some mistakes. And by learning about those mistakes that we've made, it means you don't have to make them yourself. So this should be an interesting discussion, and it might prompt you to think about the same thing with regard to your own portfolio as well. So Rob, let's kick it off with you. I know you started a little bit before I did. I think I started in about 2007. You started 2006. If you got in your time machine, went back to 2006, how would things be different compared to how you actually did do it?
It's really interesting, Rob, that you referenced that I started before you, because it's only a year, but actually at that point in time in the property market, every month it was pretty dramatic. The 2006, if you remember our cycles, we were just before 2008 where we had a crash. In 2006, however, the property market was booming and everybody was making money from property. It seemed so anyway. And I got my first property. It was a residential property, which I soon turned not too long later into a consent to let property. But that was it for me. Before 2008, that was it. That was my only one. And I went on to do stuff afterwards. But I think what's really interesting about this question for me, Rob, is, and what makes it more interesting is, we now know exactly what's happened. So we could do month by month, right? We would do this and then we would do that, because we know what would play out, which makes it kind of interesting. Of course, we don't get to do that in real life, but we can in these scenarios. So the first thing I would have done is taken advantage of the opportunity that played out at the time, which is that you could buy property for little or no money at that point in time. You didn't have to do anything that was seen to be dodgy or naughty. It was above board. You could do it, and you could buy property for little or no money down before 2008. That, to me, is an opportunity missed, I guess. But it's also a disaster avoided, because, as we know, 2008 burnt a lot of people.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that. I hadn't actually thought of that, but it is funny to think that, yeah, around 2006, you actually could do the whole no money down stuff. And people talk about no money down now, but that doesn't really exist. You can't legitimately do that. You can theoretically do no money left in, but that's difficult. But yeah, back when I was first looking into property, and when I bought my first property as well, was a resi that I always had one eye with to kind of renting out, because I knew I wouldn't necessarily be staying there long term. And when I was researching it, I was sort of reading about all this kind of no money down stuff people were doing. And I didn't know enough at that point to really understand it. And of course, I didn't really understand. I didn't have the context to know how unusual this was. It's like there was this weird window of time where you could be doing all these things and you could be really playing the rising market, making use of how lax credit was at that time. And like you say, Rob, that could have gone horrendously wrong. And I'm sort of glad to have not been involved in all that. But in a way, had I had the knowledge at the time to do a little bit of that responsibly, but without taking it too far, and have then sort of got a lifetime tracker and just fixed where I was and be sort of rescued by having record low interest rates, that wouldn't have been a bad thing to do either. But hindsight is an amazing thing. As well as that, I think the main thing that I would have done would be to buy a lot more around about sort of 2009-10. So again, I think it's not really having the historical context to realize what an opportunity it was. So when I was buying properties around 2010, they were very cheap, relatively speaking. There wasn't a lot of competition. No one else was really bidding. And I didn't know enough to know that that was quite unusual. And I wasn't thinking about the property cycle in any way because I didn't even know about it. But had I known, I would have done a lot more. I would have leveraged a lot more. I would have taken more risk and not played it quite so safe. Because looking back, of course, we now know that was the trough. That was as low as things were going to get. And over the last 6 years, things have really kicked on. And that's something that I think we've both kind of touched on. It's the cycle. We're looking back, we can see how all this maps onto the cycle. But at the time, we didn't know the cycle existed, so we couldn't really factor that into what we were doing.
Exactly. I think that's one of the big lessons from this. And when we look at what we'll do now, the cycle's going to play a big part of it. So to expand on what I would have done, pretty much exactly, I would have hoovered up as many buy-to-lets as possible pre-08 with cash flow in mind, making sure that they covered their costs, which was very difficult then, very difficult. People were advising you to buy properties with negative cash flow just because the capital growth would go up. Sounds crazy, but lots and lots and lots of people were doing it. So I would have avoided that. But if I could make it cash flow neutral and make it work, I would have done that because what we didn't know was around the corner was interest rates were about to plummet. And clearly, Rob, that made a huge impact on everybody's portfolios.
Yeah, it did. And it actually rescued a lot of the people who were doing what we were talking about earlier with all the no money down stuff, because people were buying properties with huge degrees of leverage, sometimes 100% loan to value or more, not really thinking about the cash flow, just buying purely because it's going to be worth more next month. But then even when the bubble burst and it turned out that they weren't going to be worth any more, the mortgage rates fell dramatically. So people who were on tracker rates were sort of paying, about 5% or more, suddenly fell down to the point where, in some cases, the bank were paying them to have the borrowing. And because rates have stayed long for this whole time, you've got a lot of people who would have been in massive trouble, but have been saved by that and have had a period of time where they can have some cash flow and sort of work their way out of that position.
Now, remember, these properties would have gone into negative equity, like my one property at the time did. But I've still got it today, and after the interest rates adjustments, it's made a healthy profit ever since. So absolutely no regrets there. The regret, as I say, is I didn't do more. Aggressively, with caution. So making sure I wasn't just buying anything for the sake of it, but anything that covered its costs, buying it because you needed those products to expire before they went on standard variable rates. And then from that point, enjoying a healthy cash flow. And with that cash flow, I would have used it to start buying property. I managed to do one a few years after the crash, and that was in Leeds, and that has done very well since then. But back after the crash, you had to put real money down and put deposits down. And actually, after the crash, it was more like 65% loan to value rather than 75% today. People don't remember that, but there was a few years where 65% was the norm. So much bigger deposits. Managed to do it, but I wasn't in a position that I could buy a few every single year. Back then, it was just saving, and it's that snowball effect we talk about, where you just have to snowball it out, start slow, but over time you keep adding to your portfolio, and then suddenly one's got equity, so you release some from there, you can do another one, and it all snowballs. But it was very slow for me back in the beginning. I wasn't going as fast as I'd like. I was working in property. I could see the opportunities because I could see what they were selling for before. I could see how cheap they were then. And I could see that the yields were so good, even in city centre locations. But unfortunately, the funds weren't there to do that. So if I had bought more aggressively and all the interest rates had plummeted, then that cash flow that suddenly would have been available to me wouldn't have led a rock and roll lifestyle. No, I would have been investing in property and using that to fund deposits and hopefully getting enough together to do one a year in the beginning and then accelerating it from there rather than one every few years at that point in time. So that would be for me, Rob. You kind of hinted that you would leverage up and go more aggressively. Did you have the ability to do that at that point?
To a degree. So I'm a cautious kind of person. I could have put more cash. I could have left nothing in savings. I could have just piled it all in. I could have tried way harder to push the loan to value. It wouldn't have been enough to buy masses more properties, but another 2 in London would have made a dramatic difference to my net worth today, as it turned out. Of course, I didn't know that at all. But if I'd been able to see exactly how it would work out, then it would have been a no-brainer. But we didn't know. Same when it comes to mortgage rates. Like if you're getting a lifetime tracker at that time, so you were sort of sitting around paying next to nothing on those now, would have been a great thing to do. But we didn't know. With hindsight, it's really, really easy. One thing I would have done, though, disconnected from needing the benefit of hindsight, is have had a clearer plan from the start that was more congruent with what I wanted in the long term. And that's something you can do at any point. So when I started, in common with most people, I bought my first property because I had money in the bank and I liked the idea of property, and that seemed to be what you did to get a return. But I didn't have any plan beyond that. And my early purchases were very much focused on yield. They were completely focused on the return I would make month to month. And that's just because of, I guess, my biases and my personality. Like I'd always take the sure thing now rather than the potentially bigger thing in the future. But actually, that doesn't make any sense. I should have been thinking a lot more about long-term growth because I wasn't in a position where I really needed the money then. I wasn't in a position where I wanted to get out of my job and sort of replace my income or anything like that. I had no plans to do that. I still have no plans to do that for a very, very long time. So focusing on yield actually didn't make that much sense. Of course, the properties would have needed to cover costs, but I would have given more thought to capital growth. Now, as it turned out, it didn't really make any difference because I started in London. That's just happened to be where I lived. So there was no thought behind that. And as it turns out, I got all that capital growth anyway because of what's happened to London in recent years. So actually, with perfect knowledge, wouldn't have changed a lot, but totally fluked it. And it would have been much better to have a clear plan from the start. And I think that's why I bang on about it so much now, because I didn't. And I think you're so much more likely to succeed if you think about the long term and work back from there.
So it's fun to look back at the past, especially when you know how the future's going to play out. It's like Biff in Back to the Future at the racecourse when he knows what's going to win. It's quite easy to say, right, we would have been super aggressive. But that's not what we're saying you should do. If you know the future, then you can be super aggressive. But now we move forward and go, well, what if we were starting right now? It's 2017. What would we be doing? If we were starting from scratch, it's interesting because we've already been investing. So I think what's certain is we wouldn't go and replicate our exact portfolios that we have now, because where we are at the market today is a lot different to where we've been over the last 10 years. We've moved around the cycle, and back when we started, as Rob said, neither of us knew about the cycle. We just thought property was a good thing to do. We've educated ourselves, we've immersed ourselves in this over the last decade, and now we've got better awareness and understanding. So how we would tackle it today would be very different. So Rob, what would be your first steps? You've just walked out the door. It's a lovely sunny day, but you haven't got any property under your belt, but you know you want to. What are you doing first? Okay,
well, I've already talked about the plan. I think that's really important. I'd also build a network before doing much else so I can focus on my strengths. So I think something that I'm very aware of now that maybe I wasn't before is that there are certain things I'm good at and certain things that I'm either not good at or just not interested in. So I would build up the network to allow me to do things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do by tapping into other expertise, whether that's just for advice, whether it's for working together or for whatever it is. And I think that can sound to some people like it's procrastination, it's a delaying tactic, or it's like the boring bit that you don't want to do because you just want to get out there and buy something. But I didn't do that before. I was a bit of a lone wolf. And now I'm in the lucky position where, because of the podcast and things, I've got a pretty decent network. So if I didn't have that, I know the value of it. So I'd try to build it up. Having done that, the next obvious thing to do would be to go, okay, I'm ready to invest. Well, where do I invest? And I think at this point, I'd look to pick a strong area, but I wouldn't worry too much. I wouldn't worry as much as I have done in the past about finding the absolute best area. Now, I don't mean I'd invest in the ropey part of town. I just mean, like, if you're taking the whole of the UK as your investment area, I wouldn't put as much effort as I historically have done into trying to find like the place, the postcode that's going to outperform everywhere else. Because for a start, I'm not that smart. I'm not going to succeed. But also, I don't think it matters as much as finding the right deal within the location. So fundamentals, of course, right part of town, of course, but Manchester versus Liverpool versus Leeds versus wherever else, not such a big deal. I think I'd be more inclined to just pick one and then move on from there. So that's how I would start. So I haven't actually got to the point of going and putting any offers in on any properties yet, but that's all the groundwork that I'd be doing. And I think that groundwork is important because from what I've seen in my own experience and what I've seen in other people's experiences, people who do that groundwork end up far better off than people who will just kind of get the idea one morning and be at the estate agent that afternoon. So that's what I'd do. Then there's kind of more thoughts that I've got. But Rob, I'd be curious to hear how you would get started.
I think you made a great point about the networking. I didn't really think of that. It's hard to imagine starting again because let's just assume we've got the knowledge somehow accumulated without the investing. I know that's hard to see how that'd be possible, but let's just assume we had, but we haven't got the networks. Then yeah, that's going to be super, super important because the people you work with, from the letting agents, the mortgage brokers, your solicitor, these people in your team are key. So yes, I would absolutely be looking to work with experts to help accelerate things because there's still plenty of time left in this cycle, but we're at least halfway through, if not more. So I need to be moving things forward. Yes, that takes time, like Rob said, but 6 months in the grand scheme of things, it isn't that long. I know people get itchy feet, but actually that's not too bad at all. I probably give myself a stop deadline as well that I have to invest by a certain point just so I avoided that procrastination. But part of my makeup personality, I don't think I would. But I'd just put that stopper there just as a goal. My first investment by X date. So after I've done the short-term goals, I'll be looking at the long-term goals. I'll be looking at the cycle, looking at when I want to stop investment. So putting a stop date as well on the cycle. And then I'd target a region similar to yourself, Robert. I'd be, we talk about it all the time, and the Northern Powerhouse. So I wouldn't be like, I must invest in this part now. Yes, there's parts I would stop investing in a few years' time, but pretty much it's all up for grabs at the moment in that region. And then I'd reassess it every year or two to say, right, I think this area's had the best of its cycle now. Next area, and move on like that. And I'd be just planning that out, maybe even pencil in cities at certain dates to say, right, this one probably will no longer be viable at this point in time, and work my way through that way. It's not going to be an exact science, and like Rob said, I'm not some genius that I know month by month where the property market's going to go up and down. But if you kind of go very broad brush with this, you've got a fair idea, especially if you understand the 18-year property cycle, which you can listen all about on the property podcast numerous times. Just use that search bar we talked about. So yeah, similar, Rob, actually, very similar. Just conscious that I've got a smaller window now. I've got property in the southeast of my portfolio right now. Wouldn't have that moving forward in this part of the cycle anyway. After the crash, the next one, almost certainly, But at this point in time, no. And I'd just be focusing on that region, possibly because I know it very well geographically, because I'm from there. But like you say, you can build your networks up if you're not familiar with an area anyway. And I'd start. I don't know if aggressive would be the word, but I've got more cash available to me now and more ability to fund deposits. So I would be setting myself a target to invest in a certain number each year. So very much goal driven and just very focused on where we are in the cycle and making sure I'm investing in the right times in the right places.
It's interesting what you say about having a smaller window of time. And I think that's a really important point. With the knowledge that we've now got, that we didn't have at the time, we now recognize where we are. We know that property prices don't move randomly. We know that they certainly don't just go up and up forever. We know that there's a period of time, don't know exactly when, but when it's just not going to make sense anymore and when there's going to be some kind of crash. So knowing that, yeah, it does mean that you might set more ambitious acquisition targets for the next couple of years than you otherwise would. I think that's really interesting. I think the cycle would play into what I would do as well. So I'm kind of assuming for the purposes of this question that I wouldn't have that much capital to work with necessarily, because at the moment I'm kind of using property as a sort of store of value for the long term. But if I were just starting again and I was more interested in preserving capital, I would be looking for opportunities to add value. Because of where we are in the cycle, we're sort of somewhere around about the halfway point or maybe a little bit further. It's easy to see the story for where future growth is going to be. But at the same time, it's hard to say when that'll happen. It won't happen in all areas equally. And I'd be kind of more thinking about, well, how can I make my return now? So I'd be looking for opportunities to add value. I might be looking at things like small scale commercial to residential conversions. I might be looking at mixed use. And this is where the network comes in, because when it comes to adding value in terms of conversions and stuff like that, I can't do that on my own. I wouldn't want to learn everything that I need to learn to do it on my own. And I'd have to build up the experience from scratch and learn some hard lessons. I'd far rather use someone else's experience and the lessons someone else has learned to get me there faster. So that's why I really lean on that network. I'd need to do something that I wouldn't be able to do on my own. So I'd be looking for that type of opportunity. I'd be adding the value. I'd be extracting some of the capital that went in, and then I'd be holding it for the long term. So not too different from what I've done in the past, but I'd be looking to make the money at the start rather than wait for the market to do it for me.
Yeah, I can see why you do that, Rob. It's going to really depend on your present self, whether you had the time or not, because we have to make so many assumptions in this game. I've kind of played it as everything else is the same except I have no property, so therefore I have no time. So that's why I go the angle I go down. These are always good pub games around the fire with a nice pint, talking about what would you do if you started again. We haven't set ourselves out very strict rules here, as you can imagine. We've just decided to turn on the microphones and talk about it. But we've mainly talked about very big picture, long-term stuff, which obviously is important because that's where the wealth is made, up there in the clouds. But down in the weeds, there's tactical things that we may do differently. Smaller things that can make a difference to our day-to-day lives rather than our long-term lives. So, Rob, tactically, would you attack your portfolio or change anything in your portfolio or approach anything in your portfolio any differently to the way you have in the past?
Yeah, I would. Something that seems like a small tweak, but I think actually would make a real difference, is I would rent unfurnished wherever I possibly could. Now, that's changed partially because of the tax treatment. So the wear and tear allowance that was there now isn't. So financially, furnishing makes less sense. But also when I look at the hassle and the day-to-day things that come up, it's often to do with furniture. And it's the kind of thing that you don't really learn until you get to a certain point of scale. You don't see the patterns, but it's frequently appliances. And even when it's nothing major and it's nothing super urgent, there's just kind of annoyances like buying a new mattress for this or a new sofa there. And it's money going out and it's also hassle. Now I've got someone else who deals with that for me. So it's not making a big difference to my day-to-day life. But it's the kind of thing where if I could wave a wand with my current portfolio and just make all of that go away, I would. So if I was starting again, I would do that. I would rent unfurnished. I would have the bare minimum of appliances, preferably none, and just remove that whole source of stress. Now, of course, it depends on the type of property and the type of tenant. So if I were buying the same properties again, I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that because some demographics and some types of property, they need to have that or you're going to really struggle to rent it. But if I were going down a slightly different route, I'd maybe target properties where that was an option because it's a slight pain point that I'm aware of now that I frankly wasn't before. So it's not like my life is hell because of having to deal with all this furniture, but if it could go away and I get the opportunity to start over, then that's something I'd do.
Yeah, it's something I've done in the main, except in circumstances where the market's dictated. I've had to rent it furnished. Some city centre locations do require it. Not always, but sometimes. Always check with your letting agent. But I'm completely with you, Rob. It's so much easier renting unfurnished, especially now the tax breaks have been taken away. Tactically, I think I've got a lot right. I've got a lot wrong, but tactically, things like I'd rent property out through a letting agent. Absolutely. Again, I'm just playing on the fact that I'm time poor, using mortgage brokers from the start, always have, always will do. Even though I know a lot about mortgages now, I'd still use a mortgage broker. I'd actually keep a lot the same. As I say, made plenty of mistakes, many, many mistakes. But actually understanding the cycle now, I mean, that's the most powerful thing. And maybe in the past, my biggest mistakes are opportunity cost, not doing things rather than things I did. It's actually the things I didn't do or didn't take advantage of, which have cost me the most, looking back. So it's looking forward, it's making sure I don't repeat those mistakes and having very clear goals and a very clear strategy. So even if having very clear goals and a very clear strategy, so then I'm not beating myself up, oh, could have done more, I should have done more. No, this is what my strategy told me to do. I stuck to it, so I'm happy with that.
So we kind of come back to the same place and hit on some of the same themes that we talk about all the time. Those themes being understand the cycle and having goals and holding yourself accountable to those goals. It's kind of interesting because that's not where we were expecting this necessarily to go. We were just having a chat and seeing what happened, but that seems to have been what we've come round to. And it's kind of, well, for a start, it's reassuring. It's not going, oh, but if I'd known, I never would have bought that property. I never would have done this. It is more the things that we haven't done. And it's nice that we've come back round to those topics because it shows that we're right to talk about them, because even when we apply it to ourselves and we look back at what we've done, it's those that would have made the real difference. Yes, there's tactical stuff in there, but it's those points that really would have allowed us to not have those opportunity costs and to be in an even stronger position than we are. So it's not necessarily the conclusion that I expected from this discussion, but a worthwhile one, I think.
Absolutely. And it's actually really interesting because when we go to meetups or just bump into property investors or talk to property investors in whatever capacity, often people always want tactical advice. Which area? What type of property? Should I do this or that? What mortgage? And yes, that's important. But very few people focus on the bigger picture, the goals, the strategy, how they're going to do it, where they are in the cycle. I think that's why we talk about it so much, because even though we talk about it so much, people still aren't doing it. So if you're listening to this and nodding your head in agreement, but you still haven't really thought about where we are in the cycle, what your goals are, what your strategy is, instead of thinking about what's the next best area, or should I be buying a 1-bed flat or a 2-bed flat or getting a fixed or tracker mortgage, actually take that break and think about the bigger picture like we have in this episode. You know, we've put half an hour aside for this. Maybe you should do too. Okay, Rob, we've got a resource of the week that combines two of my favourite things, walking and fundamentals. Now, don't turn off. I promise you this is a belter of a resource.
Yep, and it gives us a chance to have a little bit of a friendly competition and a showdown, so I'm looking forward to that. But first, we can't get to that without reading out an iTunes review or two, can we?
We absolutely cannot. So, this week, it's from Naz. Thank you, Naz. Rob and Rob, thank you so much for the valuable information on property. I've listened to every single episode in the space of 3 months on speed 1.5. Looking to invest in a second home for my parents before the end of the year. Thanks for your amazing and helpful podcast. Well, thank you. Thank you for your amazing review. And thank you to everybody who who's left us a review. And those people we know who are going to leave us one this week because they think, oh, you know what? I've listened for a while now and I've really enjoyed this podcast, so I'll leave a review. Yes, you know who you are. Make sure you do it.
Yeah, and I'm happy to see this 1.5 thing getting a bit of traction as well. A few people have mentioned that recently. Just it does mean that it'll be very weird when you finally meet us. We'll sound drunk all the time. Okay.
Oh, really slow and stupid.
Yeah. Instead of fast and stupid. All right. So now on to the resource of the week. Go on, Rob. Let us have it.
Okay. This actually picked up in the Property Hub forum. So there you go. It's a double plug this week. Go to the Property Hub forum because you find lots of interesting things like this. And this particular resource is called walkscore.com. Brilliant resource. Basically, what you do is you type in your postcode, where you live, and it gives you a score out of 100 for your area and its walkable fundamentals. So how close you are to a train station, how close you are to shops, your primary schools, secondary schools, hospitals, everything you can think of fundamental-wise. It kind of adds it all up, gives you a score, and then you can feel smug about your investment areas or a little bit sad. But a great research tool, actually. I know it sounds like a bit of fun, but a really, really good research tool. If you're looking for a buy-to-let property, you want an area that has the fundamentals nearby. So by getting a walk score assessment, it gives you an idea of, yeah, it's pretty strong. It's, 50 above, whatever. Or if it's pretty low, you might have to reconsider it. Or at least be confident that people are willing to use a car to get to these amenities. So, unfortunately, we had a bit of a competition.
Yep, so just popped in my postcode here where I live. 94 out of 100, Walker's Paradise. No big deal.
And mine scored 7. But this is where I live. It's not an investment. This is where I live. So I would not invest here. And you say Walker's Paradise, Rob, but when I walk, I get to see green stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And when we're recording, I hear birds chirping at your end, and you occasionally say, oh, there's a woodpecker in the garden and things like that. And I just have to pause occasionally because a dustbin truck goes past. So walking isn't everything. But like you say, as well as being a bit of fun, it is a useful tool. There's a map on there as well where you can see how far you can travel by different modes of transport within a certain period of time. So this is something I was aware of before, but hadn't thought about how to apply it to property. But I think it is a useful tool to have in there and have as part of your assessment.
So you can go direct, or you can go to the show notes this week where you can find all the links to the news stories, everything we've mentioned at thepropertyhub.net/starting again. So next week's topic, Rob, I don't want to do it. I said they've not been great the last few times round, but it's the budget 2017.
I'm really hoping this is going to be a very short episode. I'm really hoping that we just kind of come on, we say, yep, nothing to report, and then we go again. Maybe we read out a review or something, but that'll be basically it. Worst case, this is going to be a really long and anguished episode, but I'm hopeful that it's going to be a straightforward one. But we'll wait and see what Phil's got in store for us.
Yeah, I'm not expecting any reforms to benefit landlords or property investors, but hopefully some regeneration projects announced, which we can discuss. So semi-positive, or actually that's quite positive, definitely. But you offered me that now, so we obviously haven't listened to it yet. You may have by the time you're listening to this, but as we haven't listened to it, if you told me there was no new taxes on property, no relief the other way either, but there was some regen projects announced that benefit places that we invest in, I'd take that right now. But we will see. And next week we will discuss it. And of course, we'll talk about the wider economy as well and the implications of what's announced and how that possibly could affect the property market. So well worth turning up for.
Yep, do join us for that. And in the meantime, get over to the show notes for this episode, thepropertyhub.net/starting again to follow up on some of those links. And also on the Property Hub, let us know what you would do if you were starting again. Hopefully this episode's got you thinking. It'll be really interesting to see people's insights, how they'd go about doing things differently, if they would at all. So do get over to the forum and get involved there. We will be back on Tuesday with Ask Rob and Rob, and then back for that ever so scary budget episode next Thursday. Until then, have a great week. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.